So welcome, dear guests, friends. It's so nice to see professors from Norway representing 3 universities, Tromsø, Oslo, and Bergen, and the Friends of the NIA joining tonight. This is our annual lecture series, Athenæum, which is a tribute to the Athenæum Friends Association, initiated by the University of Oslo in 2019 to support the Institute during a very turbulent transition, and we are grateful. So this is devoted to Athenæum. And tonight we have the pleasure to host Alice Yijing Yang, who will deliver a fantastic lecture from the title, What is Life? An Aristotelian Solution. So I will say a couple of words about Alice and her current position. Alice is a PhD research fellow at the Department of Philosophy, Classics, History of Art and Ideas at the University of Oslo. She wrote her master thesis on a reconstruction of the dialectic between Empedocles and Theophrastus on the principle of perception based on Theophrastus' De Sensu Periaesthesion, under the supervision of Professor Xavier Tschirbrand and Professor Yijing at Sichuan University, China. She's currently working on the nutritive soul as a demarcation point of life within Aristotelian tradition under the supervision of Professor Thomas Johansen at the University of Oslo. It's very nice that you are here to be with Alice tonight. So the floor is yours, Alice. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And thank you for joining. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you very much for coming here. This is a lecture based on what I'm working on in my PhD thesis. It is not totally finished yet, so it's kind of work in progress, but I will try to articulate what I am working on and what I think is an interesting problem. And I see that in our audience, there are some who are experts in Aristotelian philosophy. For those audience, I hope my understanding can be examined. And for those who are not an expert in Aristotle's philosophy, I hope what I give can make sense to you. So today I'm going to talk about what is life as an Aristotelian solution. And this is the overview of my talk today. The first part will be some preparations to lead us into this context of between life and soul. And the second part, I will introduce you the Aristotelian context, particularly with the terminologies and models of concepts that he will use to work on how the soul is the principle of life. And the third part is the Aristotelian approach, where I will give you a picture of how the nutritive soul, according to Aristotle, is the principle of life. And then the fourth part is a review of the first book of the Anima, where I think the nutritive soul is responding to a philosophical problem that is hidden in the first book of the Anima, where Aristotle was arguing with his predecessors on how the soul could account for life. And in the last part are 2 arguments and 2 replies that this is the most work in progress part, where I have some thoughts regarding to, for example, the living bodies and also the relationship between the nutritive soul and the pneuma, and also the relationship between the nutritive soul and the teleological picture in Aristotle's philosophy. And I was told that this is supposed to last 45 minutes, so I will try to go faster as I planned earlier. Okay, so first part is the preparations, where we think about life and soul. I think it is interesting that in modern language, we still use life as if it's something that everyone understands, but we couldn't use the soul as equivalent, as easy as the notion of soul that's referring to something that we all know. And therefore, I think it's possible that the soul that worked for the ancient people probably would be translated into something else if we are thinking about it in the modern language. However, if we think of life, there seems to be no problem because we imagine that animals are alive, humans are alive, and plants are alive, which is taken for granted. But I want to say that it is an Aristotle's contribution to include plants into the picture of life, because before him or after him, for most philosophers, what matters is that animals and humans are alive. For example, the Stoics would argue that both the animals and humans have the soul as the principle to account for their life, but for plants, they don't need the soul, but they have the fuses, and that is enough. So I think it is quite peculiar that Aristotle would emphasize that plants are alive and also have a part of soul to account for it. And I think there is a shift from only including animals and human into life to including plants and the larger scope as to something being alive. And here I was going to quote the first text from the Anima, which I will read to you as is the opening of the Anima, and I think it is important. Since we suppose that knowing is a noble and honorable thing, and that one type of knowing is nobler and more honorable than another, either due to its precision or because it had better and more wondrous objects, we might on both counts with good reason place research into the soul in the first rank. And it seems also that awareness concerning the soul contributes greatly to truth in general, and especially in related to nature. For the soul is a sort of principle for the living beings. Here, it can be the tozoron here can be translated either the animals or the living beings. And I think nowadays most researchers translate into living beings because of this construct, because of the heritage of what Aristotle gives us. We seek then to study and know its nature and substance, and subsequently its attributes. Some of these seem to be proper affections of the soul, while others seem to belong to the animals on account of the living things, on account of having the soul. So obviously, for Aristotle, there's a dynamic between the soul and the life, where the soul should work as a principle that accounts for life. Here, I would like to add one more point, which I didn't write on the slide, is that the word of principle, arche, in Greek can both mean principle in modern language, or we can also say it's a starting point. As there was another talk I went to a few days ago where this lecturer argues that in practical life there are multiple principles, arche, because arche refers to the starting point of something instead of the rules of how you should work on, of the rules that you follow when you do certain things. And here I think there's also an ambiguity to understand the soul as the arche of a living thing to be both the principle and the beginning. And here I think the dynamic is that we expect there to be a theoretical structure of the soul, following which we are supposed to learn the truthness about life. But how do we know that the life that the soul is accounting for encompasses all the living phenomena? And as I just mentioned, that for Aristotle, he includes the nutritive soul. He includes plants into this picture of life. I think there is this interaction between him including these plants into the world of life, and later we will see his contribution of arguing a part of the soul, the nutritive soul, to be responsible for such life. And I think this interaction is not one-dimensional. It's not because we realize that plants are alive, therefore we need theory to account for it. But it's working two ways, in a sense that I think it is that Aristotle realized that there is something more fundamental when he is arguing with his predecessors about what is alive, where his predecessor will say that it's perception or movement. But he found a hidden promise that unites his predecessors, which later I will introduce you as a notion called living bodies. And I think it is this notion that urged for the birth of the nutritive soul. And then further is why he make this observation that actually plants are also alive because they are also this type of living bodies. And here, in the last point, I mentioned there are other approaches to life or to the soul. I listed them backwards chronologically. Henry Bergson as the philosopher who is mostly recent, and I think when he works on his philosophy of life, I can see a very strong Aristotelian influence because in his creative evolution, there is a mentioning of how living bodies being alive itself. While in Descartes, who famously came who famously came about the difference between the soul and the body, or between the spirit and the body, and he raised the difficulty of how the soul and the body connects, where I think Aristotle's solution should be able to reply to that with the contribution of the nutritive soul being part of the soul, which is inevitably linked to the body in a necessary way. And also there are medieval Aristotelianism. For example, Avicenna, who is technically an Aristotelian, but he just deleted plants in his picture of life. And he also deleted nutritive soul in his philosophical picture. That's because he cares more about animals and humans and how medicine works for those beings. So as you can see, although today I'm telling you that there is an Aristotelian solution to what is life, which refers to the nutritive soul, it's not an absolute answer. It's only one answer among many other answers. But I think his answer is very important and deserves more attention nowadays. And then even further, as I mentioned for Stoics, that plants doesn't have soul but only have a physis, and the pre-Socrates or Plato with whom he will argue with. And now I will introduce the Aristotelian context. So I'm doing this backwards. I'm not first introducing the arguments between him and the predecessor, and then introduce you what the theory of a nutritive soul looks like. I'm doing this the other way around by first introducing what is this theory and then how to put it in the context of the animal. In this Aristotelian context, there are three accounts which I just quoted from Thomas' book, which I think is a very classical description of how the soul is connected to the life through body as the bridge. And here I read. The first account is, the soul is the form of a natural body potentially having life. The second account is, the soul is the first fulfillment of a natural body potentially having life. The third is, the soul is the first fulfillment of a natural instrumental body. As you could see, there is already a lot going on here. There are a lot of terminologies, a lot of concepts, and a lot of logical relations. And I think it draws us to the first chapter of the Dilemma Book 2 and the second chapter, where I always found that argument puzzling and I always found it a bit difficult to reconstruct a coherent argumentation following the first and the second chapter of Book 2. But I think I can manage to do it today when I was preparing this. So here, basically, Aristotle's idea is that if you put your eyes off all the bodies in the world, there are one genus of things, or one type of things exist as substances. And by substance, he means it can act as the origin of something else. Here, he introduced further to contextualize this substance. He said that substances can exist in three senses. They can exist in matter, in form, or the compound of both. And it may seem obvious, like a compound of both is just a matter plus form, but it is way more complicated than how it looks like. And there's one more difference that he made it clear in his text, is that the form and matter differentiate from each other, at least in the way that the matter cannot be said of, in the sense that if something is purely a matter, you cannot point to it and say that this is a one. but the matter need a form to organize it in order to be able to be set off as a one or as an individual. So with this previous steps set up, now he invites us to think that there are bodies, soma, which are substances, and natural bodies, according to Aristotle, are substances in the sense of being principles or the beginning point, as I mentioned earlier, of other things. And here he used the plural of arche. And what do we know about these natural bodies? And further, he made a distinction saying that there are some natural bodies possess life, while others do not. And what do we mean by some natural bodies possessing life? And he moved a bit further and saying that those things that possessing life sharing certain phenomena, blah, blah, blah. But how do natural bodies, and then here is, I think I didn't do it very clearly because I'm still a little bit struggling, but I think here is a jump or referring backwards when I write the line that says that some of the natural bodies that possess life exist as substances in the sense of being compounds. And I think this was, I was following his text and I thought that it's a bit pretty weird that all of a sudden he jumps up this sentence saying that natural bodies exist as some compounds because how do we know it exists as compounds instead of something else? And I think it refers to the Alma Book 2, Text 2, which I will read it to you. So in book 1, in chapter 1, he says that now we say that one genus among the things that exist is substance, one type as matter, which is not in virtue of itself and individual, another as shape or form, in virtue of which a thing is straight and straightaway called an individual, and a third as the compound of these. Matter is potentiality, while form is actualization, and this is said in two ways. In one way as knowledge is, and in other as contemplating is. Bodies seem most of all to be substances, and of these the natural bodies, for these are the principles of other things. Some natural bodies possess life, and some do not possess it. And by life we mean self-nutrition as well as growth and decline. Hence, every natural body partaking life will be a substance, and a substance of the compound sort. And then in chapter 2, he writes, for substance is said in three ways, just as we said, of which one is form, the other matter, the third what is made out of both. And of this, matter is potentiality, form fulfillment, since what is made out of both is ensouled, the body is not the fulfillment of the soul, but it is the fulfillment of a certain kind of body. And for this reason, those suppose correctly who think that the soul neither is without body nor is some body. For it is not body, but something of body, and for this reason it exists in body, and in body of a certain sort, and not in the way our predecessors fitted the soul into a body without specifying in which body and in what sort of body. Even though it is clear that not any old thing will receive any other thing, but it happens also in this way according to reason. For the fulfillment of each thing comes by nature to be in what exists in potentiality and in the appropriate matter. It is clear from these considerations that there is some fulfillment and account of something that has the potentiality of being such. I think here we make the link between natural bodies that possess life and it being compounds with the premise that the natural bodies possess life are substances, and it has something more than just being an inert thing. And and also further, he mentioned that because natural bodies exist as a compound, and you cannot say that the soul is the body. Therefore, the soul must be the form of the compound, the form of the matter. Therefore, the soul accounts for bodies that is alive, and it is the form of some specific bodies that possess life. I think this is a whole Aristotelian context, and it only works when we think of the natural bodies in this perspective of matter form, and more importantly, the potentiality and actuality model. Because not for all the philosophers, it matters that something is in this temporality direction of potentiality and actualization, and is realizing something more. Therefore, the soul is the fulfillment of the organic body. So there are two sense of fulfillment for the soul and for the activity of the soul. The soul itself, to be the first fulfillment of the organic body, is explained by Aristotle in the sense of having knowledge or being sleeping, when you are able to do something but you are not doing it. While the second fulfillment is when you are using your knowledge, or when you are contemplating, or when you are being awake instead of being asleep. And I think the first fulfillment as the soul to be the first fulfillment, to be the realization as an individual totalité, makes differentiates Aristotle from other philosophers in the sense that he urged for a perspective of something that could have a lifeline, while others that cannot have a lifeline. For example, it's different. That's why also I wrote the problem of homonymy here, where we can imagine there's a difference between living things and non-living things. For example, between an animal and a stone. But when once something is a living thing, then it is fundamentally different from a non-living thing, and because it has this lifespan, it has this temporality that it could experience, and it could, more importantly, go to death. And when something is dead, the dead bodies is never return back to the category of an inanimate being or an inanimate bodies, because it has a different history compared to an inanimate things, which would never experience such change within a certain duration of time. But now I would like to invite you to think more about what does it mean to be alive, or what do we refer to as the phenomena of life. As Aristotle himself points out, that life can be said in many ways. If something has one of the followings, capacities, then it can be said as being alive. And the several capacities that he listed here are perception, movement and rest, nutrition, decline, and growth. And I think there's one more desire. Yeah, and there's one more desire. The soul being the principle of the capacities of a living thing are nutrition, perception, cognition, desire, and locomotion. And these are I think when he gave out the list of capacities, he didn't make an order saying which is prior to the others. But soon he led us to think that plants also share life, because plants have the phenomena of taking nutrition, growth, and decline. Therefore, plants represent the basic life form, for they only have the capacity of nutrition. Well, since I work on the nutritive soul, and I always took it for granted that plants should be alive, but I always thought that there should be something more in order to persuade an audience, or in order to persuade someone that plants are alive, not just as a given, but it deserves certain answer. And here the answer he gave is that plants have the basic phenomena of nutrition, growth, and decline. And As I mentioned earlier, I think it is not because he made the observation of what life is and then he included plant into it, but plant is actually referring to something else as the living bodies, which is more fundamental. But anyways, now we understand, if we take what Aristotle observes as true, that the phenomena of life are the capacities that he listed, then we would also agree that plants are alive. And it is due to this principle that a thing is alive, and which is the principle is the regulation of growth and nutrition. But it is primarily due to the faculty of perception that is an animal. I put this line here because I thought it is interesting that Aristotle, he mentioned that perception is what defines animal, but he never made it explicitly, at least in the anima, that the nutritive soul is the definition of the plants. He only said that it seems that plants are alive and they only have this capacity which can be separated from perception, while perception cannot be separated from nutrition. So I think that while perception can work as a definition for animals, can we really say that the nutritive soul work as the definition of plants? I am not very sure that it would work this way, because for something to be a definition is to mark the difference, to mark a difference. And I think that's why in the end I said that I want to argue that the nutritive soul is the demarcation point of life, but I didn't say that it defines the life of plants, because it is more vague for Aristotle to make an assertion saying that the nutritive soul defines life, defines the plants, but rather he made a very broad observation that there's a faculty accounts for life in general, which is the nutritive soul. And now I will give you a picture of, let me see the time, the picture of the Aristotelian approach, which is the nutritive soul. And here I think there are a lot going on, and I will try to tell the story in a cohesive way. So this slide is mostly based on chapter 4 of the Ima book 2, where he lay out all the elements of what is the nutritive soul, how it works, and how it relates to the body. So first of all, again, it's not just a dogmatic Aristotelian teach to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, and you should just accept it. But he leads us to think, to follow his way of thinking. And he started the chapter 4 by laying out the order of research, which for him is from the correlative projects to the activity of certain capacities of the soul, and then to the capacity itself, and further down to the soul itself as the principle. Here, when we ponder on different parts of the souls, either it being the nutritive soul or the perceptual soul or the intellectual soul, following his instruction, we should first think about what is the proper object or correlative object of this capacity. And it is not fully settled in the research field yet for what is the real or the proper object of the nutritive soul. There are several considerations from different researchers, and the three main ideas, I think, are to take the correlative object being either the external nutrient, which is something external to the living bodies, or take it as the internal nutrient, put it under the context of animals, the nutrient that is digested, or the final nutrient that is digested, or the whole animated beings. When you think of the functions of the nutritive soul being both nutrition and generation and reproduction, and reproduction produces a whole new living being. And currently, I would take the position of the external nutrients acting as the correlative object, but it changes its form when it interacts with the nutritive soul. And I take this position because I think ultimately the object of the soul should be something external or outside of it. So if you think that it is the finally digested nutrient, then you need a further argument to explain the continuation from the external nutrient to the internal nutrient. And if you take the whole animal or the whole living being to be the object of the nutritive soul, I think you also bumps into the problem that Aristotle urges for the asymmetry between the soul and the objects. For example, in perception, he criticized Empedocles, who failed to acknowledge the asymmetry between something that can perceive and something that is perceived. Therefore, in order to hold to this asymmetry between the living things and the objects, I think you cannot take it that the living thing itself can be its object. Later, Aristotle introduces that the activities of the nutritive soul is to take nutrition, which means to both growth and decline and reproduction. I mean, here also different researchers have different preference of how to organize the inner logics among these different activities. Some researchers take it that the functions, the activities of the nutritive soul, and therefore the functions are nutrition, growth, reproduction, and formation. For example, when you reproduce the new generation, you need to form a new embryo. But here, I take it that there are mostly two activities, which is taking nutrition and reproduction, and I put growth as a sub activity under taking nutrition, because I think you can understand growth and decline both in the sense of taking something inside, which promotes both the qualitative or the quantitative change of the living body. And why would a living thing has such functions and has such part of the soul to be the principle? I think most researchers agree that the purpose of the nutritive soul is to maintain the living being and to reproduce the next generation in order to share in the eternity and the divine. And here the only thing that I cast doubt in this purpose of the nutritive soul is that it's easy to imagine in the case of human where we have imagination and perception and therefore desire. Therefore, we would want to, for example, have kids in order to lengthen my life. But when you think of some living bodies that only have the nutritive soul as its principle, why would it have such impulse as human does to prolong its life in order to share in utility of design. So here I want to argue that the purpose of the nutritive soul is not to fulfill a desire to share the eternity, but it's more like it's the functioning of the soul itself. And then the last point is the mechanism, is how the soul uses the nourishment with heat to nourish the ensouled body. And here I also have a quote, which I read it quickly, where at the end of the Animat Book 2, Chapter 4, he says that three factors are involved: that which is nourished, that by which it is nourished, and that which does the nourishing. That which does the nourishing is the primary soul. That which is nourished is the body which possesses the soul, and that by which it is nourished is the nourishment. But that by which it nourishes is twofold: just like that by which one steers, that is either the hand or the rudder, namely either a thing that both moves something else and is itself moved, or a thing that only brings about movement. Necessarily, all nourishment is capable of being digested, and it is heat that brings about digestion. That is why everything animate also possesses heat. What nutrition is then has been discussed in outline, but it is necessary to become clear about it later on in the appropriate discussion. But sadly, there wasn't much clear discussion about the nutritive soul later in the Anima. Oh, and wait. I'll try to speed up because I see it's already 7:40. I wanted to talk more about growth and reproduction. And when Aristotle claims that the nutritive soul has a function of nutrition and of taking nutrition where growth is part of it, he included two dialectics. One is with Empedocles and the other is with Heraclitan. And I didn't notice before until recently that they're both focusing on growth, where he basically what he argues against Empedocles is that for Empedocles, the plant grows in the way that the earth is heavier and the fire is lighter. Therefore, the heavier part goes down and the lighter part goes up. That's how a plant becomes like this. For which Aristotle attacks and saying that actually for a living thing it grows in all directions and you need something to regulate this direction of growth. While when he argued with the Heraclitan, he introduced the concept of the fire being the principle of life, where some predecessors would think that fire as the heat it can cause the quantitative growth of something. But for which Aristotle attacks that if you add fuel to a bonfire, the bonfire would always go on and even get bigger and bigger. But a living body would regulate such intake of heat and it would limit the growth, the qualitative growth of such. For example, your hand will stop at certain point and it wouldn't grow finally, even if you continue eat a lot of food. And he says that this limitation of growth is also regulated by the nutritive soul. And and I'll skip the relationship between external nutrient and cell body, which I've mentioned a little bit earlier. And then the other function that is assigned to the nutritive soul is reproduction, which is to reproduce something like the original one, but not the same, of which I think we can really do some interpretation on what he says by to produce something like you, but not exactly the same as you. Because then when we put it under the teleological picture, with the soul being the final cause, then is the offspring of you still work? Is the soul of the offspring of you is the final cause of the parents' nutritive soul? If they're different, then it seems like the technological picture of the nutritive soul is not that neat because you cannot because the final goals of the nutritive soul changes from the original being to the next generation. And here I'll give you a very briefly picture of the teleology because I had a little I put this here because I read Thomas' book where he says that the nutritive soul reflects a very neat picture of the Aristotelian teleological picture. And when I first read it, I took it granted and thought, yeah, of course it is the case. And he made a very strong argument by saying that the soul is the formal cause of a living being and efficient and the final cause. And the basic idea is that for the soul to be the formal cause of a living being, it defines the living being as such. And for the soul to be the efficient cause of a living being is that the soul could, for example, in the example of digestion, it can help intake the nutrients. And for the soul to be the final cause of a living being is that the whole things that the living being is doing is for the preservation of the soul as its form. Or as some researchers would argue that for a living thing who has the desire to reproduce offspring is to preserve the whole species and then therefore to share in the eternity and design and the divine. And yeah, sorry, I didn't put it together with the final slides. But here I think, as I mentioned earlier, that if we take the example of one living thing, for example, a cat or a parent, and you can use this structure neatly to analyze this living being and saying that, yeah, your soul is the form of this being and it is the efficient cause, and all you're doing is to preserve this soul. But when you take reproduction as another function of the nutritive soul, you start to engage with a second soul or a second living thing, as Aristotle mentioned, is something like you, but it's different. Ultimately, it's a second being. It's different from you. Therefore, you're producing something with a new soul, or you're producing something with a new form. And then originally your soul is the final cause of your living thing. But when you reproduce an offspring, the soul of the offspring seems to work as another final cause. Or would you acknowledge there are two final causes? Or would you think there is only one soul which is only duplicating itself by producing the next generations? But Aristotle also said that you are not the same as offspring because you are different. Then I think there's something going on that we need to further make a difference between the parents and the offspring, in the sense of they both sharing soul. The soul are like to each other, but they're not identical. And I think there's something more going on. It may clash with the teleological picture. And I was planning to go back to Daima book 1, because I think there are a philosophical problem that the nutritive soul refers to, which is the living bodies, which the predecessors ignored, but Aristotle noticed. But I realized I don't have enough time, so I'll go this quickly. So in the Dilemma Book 1, basically, Aristotle introduced two camps of predecessors who, while doing the similar research as he claims, to try to use the soul to articulate for life, they identify life to be either something that can perceive or something that is able to move. And in the meantime, they also have different opinions on what the soul is as the principle to articulate for life. While some philosophers think that the soul is something very small, refined, but in the end material, be it either elements or monads. While some other philosophers think that the soul is something incorporeal, be it a number, not elements, but a ratio. And I think a key difference between the predecessors and Aristotle is that, and also I noticed in his argumentation, that when he criticizes his predecessors, he never mentioned body, soma, when he reports his predecessors, but he constantly returned back to the notion of the body when he attacks them. So I think he is making but Plato was an exception. Plato acknowledges the body, but so all the other predecessors, be it either those who think something is alive has perception, or those who think that something is alive because they can move. I think for Aristotle, what they ignored or what they took for granted was that for something to be able to perceive or to be able to move, they have to, first of all, to be a living body. There has to be something as a substrate for the further faculties, which it's so easy to ignore because for example, our body is kind of working under notice right now when we are breathing and we're not thinking. And I think it is the living bodies that unites both perception and locomotion and the movement. And it is this that Aristotle made the notice on, and that's why he argues against his predecessors. For example, with the camp of movement, he mentioned that if he argues that if the soul is something material, it would be able to move in and out of a body, or the soul would take the same space as the body, or if the soul is a monad or a number, all the monads or numbers should share the same quality. Thus, the soul cannot be differentiated as something that can cause movement. And when he argued with the camp of perception, he mentioned that if you think the soul composes of certain elements, just like the bodies, then you cannot make a difference between what is perceived and what perceived, which means everything would be alive and share the soul, and it can be panpsychism. Or that you cannot make a difference between certain part of your body that can perceive, while certain part of your body cannot. For example, you can use your eyes to see, but you cannot use your hair to perceive. And also further, you cannot make the difference between the soul and the body if they're both material. And as I mentioned, that I think Plato is a different opponent. And also I think that Aristotle was thinking in line with Plato. And I think Plato influenced his work in the soul body sense because Plato mentioned the body a lot in Timaeus, where the body was used strongly as a notion that operates with the soul, and it is the substrate of the soul, which is mentioned in Timaeus. But as what Aristotle attacks Plato was that Plato failed to account for a necessary connection between the soul and the body. Therefore, once you die, your soul leaves your body, but it cannot come back. So I think there is an urge for the account of a living body in this picture, and the mentioning of plants being alive at the end of the Alima 1.5. Living body that contains the soul within it, and therefore differs from a non-living body. Such a living body is the basis for further capacities, such as perception or locomotion. This living body, for only being alive, shares a part of the soul to account for it. Predecessors ignored an aspect of a purely living body because they are not operating in the mindset of telling the difference between living things and non-living things. This is just my interpretation. This is me trying to rationalize why predecessors didn't mention living body, at least according to Aristotle's report. And Plato ignores this aspect of a pure living body because for him, the soul is something incorporeal and could leave the body when one dies, for example, in Phaedo. And finally, Aristotle's contribution is that he recognizes that among natural bodies, some can share life, thus share temporality or the potentiality-actuality model, with a direction from life to death, or in another word, a lifespan. This aspect is accounted by a part of the soul. Hence, the question hidden in the Anima first book would be, why are some natural bodies alive but others not? What unites perception and movement as a hidden or self-evident premise? How to connect this premise to the soul, which all of them believes is the principle of life? So it kind of loops back to what I said in the beginning that I think through the dialectic in the first book, it is what Aristotle noticed that his predecessors ignored the living bodies that inspired him to invent this part of the soul, the nutritive soul, to account for such living bodies. And then further, he assigned such living bodies to plants. So it's not the other way around that you assume that, of course, plants are alive, therefore I need something to account for it. It's actually the other way around. I think the nutritive soul came first, and then plants being alive came second. And finally, I had very quick two arguments and two replies. Two arguments. The first argument is what I've mentioned, that I think in a classical soul-body relationship context, what the soul operates in pair with is not body, because body can be easily understood as something that is inert or as something that is only material. Rather, the soul is always operates in pair with a living body, a body that is that how to say it in more specific words. A living body is a body that is changing following certain regulations, and such regulation is prescribed by the soul. And a second argument is that a living body has the nutritive soul functioning as its principle. Such a living body has autonomy in the sense that the nutritive soul governs the activities of such a body, from self-preservation, self-protection to reproduction. The claim of all the living beings reproduce in order to share in eternity and divine should not be interpreted as a desire, or a wish. I don't remember the Greek word now. But it is within the autonomy of the living body. It is how living things function. So here I am trying to put my fingers on the force, the nutritive soul, or the soul as being a force of life, where you don't need something more to account for the phenomena of reproduction. I think the nutritive soul itself is enough, because the living bodies itself being alive is functioning in all aspects and is regulating its activities constantly. And then two replies, very quick. The second reply I've mentioned between the nutritive soul and a neat picture of the teleology. The first reply is between pneuma and the nutritive soul. I've seen that some researchers would argue that nutritive soul is only a different way of referring to pneuma, because they think that in the more biological or physiological writings, pneuma is working as the principle of how a living thing functions. But I think you cannot take nutritive soul as identical to pneuma or as an alternative word of pneuma, because then we would fall back to materialism, and that's because pneuma as a whole air inevitably has certain traits of a material, while Aristotle strongly fought against those philosophers who think that the soul could be in any sense material, for example, elements. So I think that we should stick to that the nutritive soul refers to the whole living body as the first fulfillment. It refers to a living body or living bodies. Then how do we reconcile the relationship between the nutritive soul and the pneuma, especially in the sense of how the nutritive soul manages to get in touch with nutrients and even use the heat as a tool? Here I acknowledge the difficulty between the nutritive soul and the pneuma, because if you only understand the nutritive soul as something formal, then when you try to reconcile the mechanism picture he provided at the end of the Anima 2.4, then you need to provide a further bridge to explain how it is possible for a formal principle to be able to use nutrients, which is of course material, to feed the ensouled body. Therefore, and in short, how is it possible for something formal to get in touch with something material? And I think it is possible to think in the way that the nutritive soul as a living body is able to use nutrients, in the sense that if you think of the nutritive soul as a concept that is referring to the living bodies as a whole, then it is not something else or something extra that is different from the living body itself that is feeding the living body. But it is the living body itself. It's not something else that is feeding the living body, but it is the living body itself feeding the living body. And the nutritive soul is a regulation of such activities. That's how it works as the principle of such living phenomena. And I think that's all for today. Thank you. Now, welcome questions.
Thank you so much for sharing very directly some of your thorough research questions in your work. So you have challenged the audience, and now we take comments and questions. Professor Folkman?
Yeah, thanks for this. This is very interesting, and as you know, as we all know, very complex material. So I have a question that is one way I think sort of naive and basic, but there's this definition of the soul as the first activity or enterekeia or energeia of a natural body that potentially has life. And also he seems to talk about, well, when he talks about soul, he would respond to people who had naive ideas about soul by saying things like, what are you talking about? There's some such thing as soul. Which kind of soul are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Are you talking about nutritive soul or perceptual soul or rational soul? Similar, I think, if you talk about life, there's no such thing as just living. There's one or another way of living, and he uses his biology to show us the complexities. So the very sort of naive question then is sort of, does he need two words? Could he put just a copula between life and soul? Or is it important to him that life is one thing and soul is another?
That's a very good question. I think it's the second option, that life is one thing and soul is the other. But as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a dynamic between life and soul in the sense that it's not just, as you also mentioned, there are different phenomena of life. It's not like we take everything it's not like everyone understands the same. And also the same for the soul, that everyone has their own operation. They use the notion of soul according to their own desire, different philosopher, different preferences. But I would say that so the soul and the life are different. And also, as I mentioned, that nowadays we can still understand life relatively easy. It's relatively easy for us to convey to each other and say, this thing has life. But it's much more difficult to convey to each other and say, this thing has a soul, right? So I think they're different from each other in the sense that life is a term that refers to a more general things. Like if we try to use concept to grasp our living experience or our or any phenomena that appears to us, I think life is a more broad term. It's more versatile, and it's easier to reach consensus about what could roughly be life or not. While soul, at least, I mean, in modern knowledge, we know soul is used by everyone in different way. But for Aristotle and for the predecessors, it is a very, or at least I think Aristotle actually made it technical. Therefore, it holds the position of a principle or of the, it holds a metaphysical position that it's possible that we hope to build a knowledge around the soul, which should help us understand life, which is something more loose. Therefore, you cannot just put a couple between soul and life, but soul is a very important and fundamental concept as a tool used by Aristotle to navigate his way all the way to life. And he makes this link, which is basically his whole metaphysical picture that is different from other philosophers' way of making the link between the soul and the life. And of course, I think this is only one piece of his whole philosophical picture, of his metaphysical picture. Yeah.
And I think that's also one reason why it's so good to keep focus like you do on the the relation to, and actually also being aspects of each other between the soul and body, because also I think otherwise Aristotle would get into the sort of trouble that he would really ridicule others for doing if you put, like with this definition that we both quoted, if you put his definiens into his definiendum, he's, you know, he's completely, he's in trouble.
Yeah.
There's that too.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize that, well, I've been fascinated by first and second chapter of the Lima book too. That I think it's important that we operate under this context. He provides us that natural bodies. He emphasized on the difference between living beings and non-living beings among natural bodies. And he also emphasized on the homonymy problem that a dead body is not inanimate body. I think the contribution he made is that when you're emphasizing somebody to be alive, it's a living body, then it is metaphysically in a totally different domain compared to those that will never be animated. And also he cut the possibility for something inanimate to magically becomes alive. That's also why I didn't mention here, but I think there was a problem of formative problem, whether the embryo would grow to gradually possess a soul at a certain point. I think it's not a real problem to Aristotle, because I think for Aristotle, if something is alive, and then it is always in this direction from potentiality and actuality, or using modern term or temporality. It's not that accurate, but it points to what I think Aristotle is emphasizing. Yeah. Thank you.
Have a like well, first of all, thank you for the talk, and I have a little like clarification question. So
yeah,
you mentioned that like the how we distinguish the nutritive soul from the pneuma is that like the nutritive soul, you can understand it as the living being feeding the living being itself, but like doesn't the nutritive soul have to go through a process like you eat the food and the nutritive soul transform it into some kind of nutrition? So you have to have interaction with something other than your living being. So I think for this.
Yeah. It's a good question, and I am trying to articulate that I think for how nutritive soul works and how pneuma works are two picture with different how to say, like something like how pneuma works is a more detailed examination. But how the nutritive soul works is a more, take a step back and the whole picture. And when I say that it's not the nutritive soul takes the nutrient, because as I mentioned, if we understand the nutritive soul as a form, then it shouldn't be something material. And then there would be a problem of how something formal could get in touch with nutrient as something material and even use it, right? Because if there are two different categories of things, then they cannot even interact with each other for further activities. So I would think one possible way out is to think of the nutritive soul as a term that refers to the living being as a whole. So it's like, therefore, it's the living being itself feeding itself. The living being itself is feeding itself. And the nutritive soul is a term to describe how it is working. Yeah.
Comments, questions?
Thank you, Alice. So if Plato in the Phaedo said that the living body is alive because of the presence of the soul, and death happens when the soul is separated from the body. I mean, one might think that that's already working with the notion of the soul as the cause of life in a living body. It's what brings life to the body. So I see that you're making a distinctive point when you're saying that for Aristotle, it's the living body somehow that's the exponendum. That's the thing that the soul has to explain.
Yeah.
But I just wonder whether Plato couldn't go along with that unless you say something else on top of that about what goes into that explanandum, how you understand the living body, so that the soul cannot be a cause of it in the way in which it's the cause of life in the body, in the feeder. So do you want to say a little bit more about how to couch, how to phrase that explanandum to separate it from what Plato is?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. As far as I know, if so in Phaedo that the soul is something that can leave the body, and Aristotle mentioned in Dilemma Book 1 that if you imagine the soul to be something that can leave, then it could also go into the body again, which in his picture of life, he rejects such idea because the lifespan of a living thing for Aristotle is, I'm hesitant to say that it's one direction. It's always from potentiality to actuality to actuality. It's always from when you're younger and then you're older and you mature and then die. So I think this lifespan is, for example, first of all, this lifespan is not something that Plato's sense of soul could account for. And then second of all is that Plato, he mentioned that there could be an appetitive soul, and it locates in the belly, and it is responsible for your appetites and he also mentioned nutrition, I think, a little bit, but he didn't mention, I don't think he made it more explicit what life means to him, at least not in the sense of what Aristotle articulated as taking nutrition, therefore self-preservation and reproduction. And I think more and more, for example, self-protection against the environment. So I think Aristotle, he added up more. Yeah, he adds more to this expandum to secure his own notion of life, which he urges for the nutritive soul to be responsible for. But I feel like for Plato, he doesn't worry about how to account for example, why you experience certain changes through your whole life till you die. Because for him, the soul doesn't get eroded when you die, but the soul will just leave. It's the body that is changing, not the soul is changing, right? Yeah, I need to think more, but I think it's a very good question. And I think Aristotle in a way is in line in the thought. He is in line with Plato, but he wants to make a distinction that differs him from Plato. But I think I need to come up with a better answer to that. Therefore, to not put him under this category of Plato, but he is himself. Yeah.
That's just a Platonic follow-up question.
Yes, please.
Cognition. So if you say that the explanandum is a living body,
yeah,
is it assumed then that cognition will be an embodied process? Because, I mean, when Aristotle mentions nous as one of the things in terms of which we say that things live, it's not clear that that's to be understood in the sense of nous, or you translate that as cognition, I suppose, and that's going to be an embodied process. Of course, the plot will think it'll be very complicated when we get to far here, the nous, at least in one sense, is an embodied process at all. So I mean, this is a bit following on from Halvard too, but it's sort of, I mean, if one thought that soul was the cause of life, you could see easily why you'd want to mention nous there as a way of living, right?
Yeah.
But if you're already assuming somehow that what we're talking about is soul as the cause of a living body, right, it's less obvious how nous is going to fall under the scope of that explanation.
I think it's not that the nous has to fall into the scope of the living bodies, but the living bodies is a precondition for something. At least for Aristotle, he didn't know anything about AI, and for him, something has to first of all has a living body in order to be able to participate into contemplation. I mean, we leave the having bodies aside.
Right.
Yeah. So we're only talking about a sublunar world, and I think in the sublunar world, yeah, in the sublunar world, even if cognition is one of those things that that makes it qualified to be alive, you still need a body to be able to participate in nous, right? How do you otherwise? So therefore, I don't think there is a problem with nous anymore. If you think it this way, that you need a living body, and then you can do contemplation or whatever intellectual activities.
Right, that's where you would land in a way.
Uh-huh.
The way it's set up is that you say that something is alive if it has either nutrition or any of these, right? And nous is one of them. So the question is not necessarily set up in this hierarchical way, that you have at least, the point is not you have at least nutrition. I mean, that will develop as a truth, at least sublunar beings, but this question set up as having one of these in your life. So it's just a bit of question about how it's set up.
Yeah. But it is set up by Aristotle himself, and I think he set up this way because he needs to first. Well, if you want to catch someone's attention, you would list a bunch of things before you give them the order, right? Like those people who pray, because it's very likely that people would ignore that you need to first be able to live in order to participate in perception or in intellects. But especially for human, it's kind of intuitive that, of course, I'm alive because, like Descartes says, I'm thinking, that's why I'm here. And when he introduced the list of capacities, he's not saying that there's no hierarchy among these capacities, but I think it's purely listing those capacities that in general what people would observe. But then later he will say, hey, but actually it's not just, they're not even, but there's a hidden hierarchy, and he is going to lay out the hierarchy. And therefore he said that, and then I think after he listed these capacities, he soon said that it is because of nutrition that something is alive. Yeah. I don't know if it answered your question. And also, I want to give you a further follow-up to your Platonic comment. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, never mind, I forgot. But it was something related to what you wrote in your book about the teleological picture. And I think there's a difficulty that Aristotle, he may have realized that to assign the nutritive soul to the plants, and to also in the meantime to introduce the natural ladder of plants and animals and humans, we will soon bump into this difficulty that nutritive soul cannot bear the potentiality for the next ladder for the animals. So if we imagine this natural ladder as the lower ladder, being the basis of the second ladder, but there is still a gap between, for example, he says that the nutritive soul can exist potentially in nutritive soul for animals, but the nutritive soul of the plants can never evolve into animals. I don't know if it's clear. So I think there is a difficulty for his teleological picture, and I think that's also maybe why he didn't make it specifically that nutritive soul is a definition of plants, but he said that perceptual soul is a definition of animals. Because if you acknowledge that nutritive soul is a definition of the plants, then you engage this difficulty of climbing up these ladders where there's supposed to be some continuity to lead you all the way to the God. Yeah.
On this talk of perception, there was a question, and I must say I'm not in this field, so I must apologize if this is a silly question, but there was a demarcation between plants and animals that you just mentioned, that plants don't have perception, animals do. And I wonder, what is it meant when we use the word perception? Does it sort of inhold cognition, or is it a more sort of somatic meaning that one can take in information from the outside world?
Well, I think an easy way to reply to what is perception is to take a step back to sensation and say it's the use of your sensual organs in order to take information of the outside world. But I think it's more complicated when you ask me to,
Because I guess my follow-up is, how important do you think the demarcation between animals and plants is? Because I could foresee some arguments coming that you could say that in some sense plants do have some means of perception, i.e. responding to stimuli from the outside world using some, cellular device. And so then I wondered, does this kind of create difficulty between this demarcation, or?
Well, I think a very simple Aristotelian response to that question is that plants don't have sensory organs. Therefore, plants may interact with the world. It has the leaves or the fruits or the flowers as, according to him, the reproductive organs or the nutritive organs, but it doesn't interact with the world in the way of an animal does with their sensual organs. And I would like to say that what you asked, it's also related to what Thomas asked me about, is that, so I argue for the nutritive soul to be the principle of a living body. Then does the living body of a plant the same as the living body of an animal? And I think it's, I don't know if that would demonstrate be detriment to my argument or not, but I think there are differences between animals' living bodies and the plants' living bodies.
Alice, I think you are preparing for your viva with all the philosophers asking questions and the audience. So thank you so much. We can continue over a glass of wine.
Thank
you all for your contribution and attending. Good luck.
Thank you.